Good evening and welcome to the library. I'm Sarah Falls, Chief of Researcher Engagement here at the Library of Virginia. I'm very pleased to welcome author and journalist Andrew Lawler, who will be discussing his latest book, A Perfect Frenzy, a royal governor, his black allies, and the crisis that spurred the American Revolution. In his book, Lawler explores the surprisingly little-known story of the early American Revolution in Virginia, focusing on Lord Dunmore, the colony's royal governor, commonly portrayed as a villain, who opposed the patriots and destroyed the port of Norfolk. The events that unfolded in 1775 and the first half of 1776 shed light not only on Virginia's critical role in pressing for independence, but on the origins of America's present-day conflicts around race, gun control, immigration, and the divide between urban and rural communities. Some of the documents that Lawler used in his research are actually on view here tonight in our pop-up exhibit, which is right outside in the pre-function hallway. And of note, we also included the finis page, which is the final page from the House of Burgess. So that's a special treat. I really recommend taking a look. Andrew Lawler is a journalist and an author who has written about history, science, religion, and politics from dozens of countries. In addition to A Perfect Frenzy, he is the author of the prize-winning Under Jerusalem, The Buried History of the World's Most Contested City, the national bookseller, The Secret Token, Myth, Obsession, and the Search for the Lost Colony of Roanoke, and the acclaimed Why Did the Chicken Cross the Road, the epic saga of the bird that powers civilization. Andrew's byline has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic, Smithsonian, and many other publications. He is a contributing writer for science and contributing editor for archaeology, as well as a National Geographic explorer and a Pulitzer Center grantee. His work has won a number of journalism awards and appeared several times in the Best of Science and Nature writing. A book signing will follow the talk. This event, part of the library's programming commemorating Virginia's role in the 250th anniversary of American independence, marks the 250th anniversary of Lord Dunmore's abandonment of the governor's palace in Williamsburg. So, without further ado, welcoming Andrew Lawler.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Everybody hear me okay? Great. Yes? Good. Well, it's nice to be introduced by Sarah because we were talking a few minutes ago and she said that she was from Norfolk. And I was like, really? Her family's the McPhillips family. I said, oh, well, Peggy McPhillips, who introduced me last night at the MacArthur Memorial, is her cousin. It's always nice to come back to Virginia where somebody is connected to somebody. Yes, and this is a really great week to talk about Lord Dunmore, given that just, 4 days ago, 250 years ago, he left Williamsburg, and right now would be floating in the York River. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, I need to provide you with some street creds, and these came out of my attic a few weeks ago. And these are images that were taken of me when I was about 10 or so by my grandparents, who forced me to go to places like Williamsburg and Yorktown and Jamestown, where they relentlessly took photos of me. So you can see my grandparents looking very colonial indeed, and then me standing there looking a little glum. But the point of these images are that for me, the revolution was not something I read about. It actually was a real living part of my life. Every weekend we were off visiting some historic site. Now, at that age, of course, the revolution was a really simple thing. right? It was between the good guys and the bad guys. And we know who those bad guys were, right? Primarily, our friend King George III. And I imagine there are a few people who've seen Hamilton here. Yes? Raise your hand. Yes, a few. So you know that King George, even now, 250 years later, is portrayed as the problem that had to be solved by independence. And of course, then we have here George Washington and Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson, the good guys, the ones who wanted to get rid of this evil tyrant. So that's what I was raised with. But I was raised also with Lord Dunmore. He was very much a part of my young life because we would go down to St. Paul's Church, where, of course, you've got that cannonball stuck in the side of the church. And here's the proof, right? Fired by Lord Dunmore. I mean, he probably put the match to the touch hole himself. And now we know that from what the patriots said, that he was a bad guy. He was a drunk. He certainly was the only British leader to burn an entire American city to the ground. And if George Washington says that somebody's an arch traitor to the rights of humanity, then that carries a little bit of weight. And Abigail Adams, somebody that you would never want to contradict, she complained that Virginians had been duped by a Dunmore. So this was the bad guy that I learned about as a child. And then, I won't go into how it happened, but basically I took my mother to Williamsburg during the pandemic and was poking around in a bookstore and ran across a mention of Dunmore that was a piece of his life I hadn't known about. So I started to dig. And I was really curious to find this man behind the myth that I had been taught. And of course, he was from the Highland. He was a Highlander. He had kilts and everything. And what's interesting about Dunmore is that he joined the Jacobite Rebellion. Now, show of hands, you've seen Outlander. Okay, a few of you. Half of you aren't going to admit to it. It's okay. It's all right. So here we have the future governor of Virginia participating in a rebellion against the father of King George III, right? These were Scots, not just Scots, but Jacobites who wanted to overthrow the Hanoverian kings, these foreign German kings, and put a good Stuart back on the throne. Now, of course, it failed. And in fact, Dunmore's father, who was at that point he was an adult. Dunmore was probably a young teenager. His father was convicted of treason and was almost executed. But fortunately, another family member had good connections, and he was put under house arrest. But Dunmore was raised with this cloud over his family's name. I mean, they were traitors. And it was very difficult, but he finally managed to get into the British Army. And then when King George III came to the throne, he wanted really to make nice with the Scottish aristocrats. He wanted to bring them back into the fold. And so Dunmore became let's say, he benefited from this change of policy. He became a member of the House of Lords, and he also spent a lot of time in Edinburgh at a time that was what we call the Scottish Enlightenment. So Lord Dunmore, the drunk buffoon I learned about, used to hang out with Adam Smith. He used to hobnob with David Hume. I mean, these very, very famous intellectuals from that day, they knew Dunmore and they respected him. So a very different picture started to emerge for me. Now, eventually Dunmore had to get a job. He might have been a Scottish aristocrat, but those villages weren't producing enough money to pay for his lavish lifestyle, and it was quite lavish. And so finally he had to find a job in the civil service. Fortunately, his wife's sister married an important British minister. Next thing you know, he's on his way to New York to serve as the royal governor. Brought in a really good salary, and so finally his wife could relax a bit. They had, at that point, I believe, 6 children. So it was really important for him to not go more deeply into debt. Now, he was really happy in New York. He loved New York. He loved the intellectual give and take. He loved the activity. He loved the urban scene there. So he was really reluctant to go to Virginia when Lord Botetourt died, and the king said, "Go south, young man." And Dunmore refused. And finally, the king had to really order him, said, "No, I'm serious. Go to Virginia. We need a governor there." Even though it was a much better post than New York, paid better, It was obviously, the most important colony, but nevertheless, he was reluctant. He finally did, and he brought his library an incredible collection of musical and scientific instruments that showed his kind of Scottish education and learning, and also, of course, his bulldog Glasgow. So let's talk about Virginia in the 1770s, prior to the Revolution. Most of you will know some of this, but maybe not all of it. We know, of course, it was the oldest, largest, wealthiest, and most populous of all the colonies by far. You could almost put all of New England into Virginia and have room left over. Now, it was a rural place, mainly because everyone was growing tobacco, or many people were growing tobacco. That's how the wealth was generally generated here. And these plantations on which it was grown, they really were, plantations is such a romantic word, but really these were forced labor camps, which by that period were mostly made up of black people who were working in lifetime servitude, and they were overseen by a white family. That's what a plantation was. And 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved, so a very large percentage of the population. Now, the people who controlled the colony really wasn't the king. It was the gentry who controlled the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. They were maybe not so dissimilar from today, really not keen on taxes. It was always a struggle to get infrastructure. Virginia always lagged behind the other colonies when it came to building roads and lighthouses and all the basic, the basic infrastructure you need in a colony. And Dunmore actually did a lot to try to change that. The big issue that the gentry had with England, with Britain, had nothing to do with tea or taxes. They could care less. Really, it was about land. Why? As you grow tobacco, it sucks the nutrients out of the soil. You got to move west. You got to constantly be getting new land. So if you want to maintain your wealth or get wealthier, you need more land. And by the 1770s, it was clear that that land was to be found on the other side of the Appalachians in the Ohio Valley. So the king, however, did not want the white people to go over the mountains because he knew they would start fighting with the Indians. There'd be a war. He would have to pay for it. Britain was already in debt from the previous war. So he was trying to be fiscally prudent and said, white people stay to the east. The Indians are now my subjects there on the left in the west. So, of course, this created a lot of resentment by people like George Washington, who wanted that land. Now, there were also Scottish traders, and this often gets missed in a lot of history books, but Virginia's economy was largely controlled by a small group of Glasgow traders who came over here in the 1750s and 60s, captured the tobacco trade. They were the ones who took the tobacco to Britain and then brought goods back here to sell. They became fantastically rich and highly resented by the planters, who saw them as kind of middlemen who were taking money out of their pocket, although they actually were borrowing money from these Scottish traders. So it was a very complex relationship in which you see the same tropes used about Jews as about the Scottish traders in Virginia. So, and just to mention briefly, the slave trade, there's this mention, I always run across this in history books, that well, the Virginians, they had slaves, but they really tried to end the slave trade. I never could understand that. Like, what? And of course, the answer is quite simple, and it's there in the documents. And you catch them saying very clearly why they wanted Britain to end the slave trade. It's because the more enslaved people who were brought to Virginia, the less their enslaved people were worth if they wanted to sell them. So this was all about maintaining your investment. Okay. Just very quickly, because you all know Williamsburg, I assume most people here have been to colonial Williamsburg and its restored splendor. And it really was a village. It's a couple thousand people with a few fine buildings, but it really was a place the gentry would come from their plantations for court days, Burgesses meetings, and then they go home. So Dunmore's living here in the palace, seen here below, and in his time, from 1771 to 1775, he became part of the gentry. He bought enslaved people, he bought plantations, he was one of them, and they loved him. He was trying to overturn the king's decision not to allow people to go west. He wanted to get rich too, and people like Washington befriended him in part because they knew he had influence in London and that he could get them this land that they so desperately wanted. So in 1774, and Brent Tarter, I highly recommend coming to his talk about Lord Dunmore's war. In that war, just to make it brief, at the cost of very few lives, he manages basically to double the size of Virginia, to take all of Kentucky away from the indigenous peoples, particularly the Shawnees. And this made him a hero. So the end of 1774, December of 1774, Dunmore returns from the Ohio on this long campaign, 5-6 months in the field, and he has done what no other Virginia governor has done, really expanded the colony's size and put a stop to what was seen as Indian depredations. So at this point, he's kind of riding high, but of course, then comes the spring of 1775. Whoops. Let's see. Okay. Well, we're going to talk about Norfolk first. So let's talk about Norfolk. Williamsburg being a small place, a couple thousand people. Norfolk, by contrast, was much more like, say, Kingston in Jamaica, or one of these wild West Indian port towns. It was founded in 1680, and it stayed kind of a small regional port until these Scottish traders arrived in the 1750s and 60s. And as they got the tobacco trade and they became wealthy, they plowed their profits not into some big country house in England like the English tended to do. Instead, they built distilleries and factories and an amazing kind of industrial complex in this kind of marshy, low-lying area that had one of the best harbors, and still does, one of the best harbors in the world. And it's really interesting to try and put ourselves back in that time, because Norfolk is not talked about much in the records, in part because there's nothing left of colonial Norfolk. We'll get to that. But it was a powerhouse. It was this boom period of the 1760s and 70s that really helped to power the Virginia economy. Now, nearly half of the residents were enslaved, but it was a very different kind of enslaved population. These were urban people who often were literate, often lived with their families. The women often were domestics in townhomes with wealthy whites, while the men often worked in factories. So the slave labor, it's still slavery, but you have black men working as crew, you have them working as pilots in the warehouses. It's a very different kind of enslavement in which there's opportunity to earn some money on the side, a measure of freedom that you simply didn't have on these forced labor camps, strung out in the Virginia backwoods. So it was a place also where black and white people mixed. These taverns are all these great examples of the authorities trying to prevent white and black people from hanging out in taverns together and enslaved people from talking to the working class whites. So there was tension because, of course, the colony's run by the gentry, and to them, Norfolk was, in that sense, a threat. Their enslaved people could leave and go and reinvent themselves in the big city. There was also this tension, as I mentioned, between the Scots, who made Norfolk their base, and the people of English descent who ran the state, the colony. Okay, now we get to spring 1775. So 250 years ago this spring, Patrick Henry made his famous speech here in Richmond, "Give me liberty or give me death." And what he wanted was to get these conservative gentry to get off their butts and create a militia outside of British control, as was being done in New England. In fact, right then is when things started to go south, so to speak, in New England. Now, the goal was not to create a new nation. This is very important. The goal was to go back to those good days before the king put the limits on the colonists' ability to move west, and then the whole tax business, right? So the idea was to, just basically leave us alone, let us do what we want to do, and everything's going to be good. It wasn't talk of independence. It was just not on their radar. Now, in April of 1775, then, Dunmore, aware of what's happened in Richmond, has to do something. He's actually stayed really quiet. He really doesn't say anything publicly about this revolution that's beginning to happen. Even though the courts are closed, these committees of safety are basically running the colony, but he plays it cool. But then he can't. After this this actual decision by the gentry to go against the king, he has to choose. And I think it's an interesting question of why he didn't choose the patriots. All his land was here, his money was here, his family by then was here. He had a lot to gain by throwing in with the patriots. But remember, he had already fought in one rebellion, and that did not end well. So he probably was a little skittish about going up a second time against the might of the British Empire. But be that as it may, he decides to take the gunpowder that's housed in the lovely octagonal building in the middle of Williamsburg, put it on a ship. It's only a dozen and a half kegs, half kegs. It's not a lot of gunpowder we're talking about. It was more symbolic. But the patriots, of course, didn't like this. There's an armed mob that protests this. And a couple of days into this crisis, which is happening at the same moment, or actually 2 days after the battles of Lexington and Concord in New England, about, of course, which they knew nothing, a couple of days later, the governor says, if you attack me and my family or my few officers, my dozen or so troops, then I will free the slaves. Now, this was a really good short-term strategy because, let me tell you, the patriots backed off because they did not want a slave insurrection. But, of course, it also created some measure of outrage throughout the colonies. And why was this such a big deal? It's a big deal because in colonial Virginia, if you were a white person, and there was a high percentage of people who owned, generally you owned one or two enslaved people. The people who owned more than 100 there were probably only a half dozen who owned that many. We're talking about very small scale enslavement. And this meant that people all over Virginia who were white, even if you didn't own an enslaved person, your neighbor did. So there was always this fear that these people who were being held in lifetime servitude would rise up. Or worse, they would cut your throat at night while you were sleeping, or poison your meal. You see this all the time, recurring fears about what enslaved people are doing and plotting. And it's clear the patriots had no interest in emancipating those who were enslaved. Landon Carter, always good for a quote, said, "Slaves are devils, and to make them otherwise than slaves will be to set devils free." So this gets across the terror that the white population as a whole felt. So when Dunmore, actually long before the revolution began, he even noticed, he said, well, you know, if the French or Spanish were to come in and try and take over Virginia, they could just walk in, it'd be a cakewalk, because the enslaved people would rise up and they would join with the conquerors and of the white-controlled Virginia. So he was aware of this, as was, of course, James Madison, who said, "We shall fall like Achilles by the hand of the one that knows the secret." And so Dunmore knew the secret, and that is, this was the underbelly of the revolution. So this is the beginning of this fascinating alliance between the people at the very top, the person at the very top of the social pyramid, Lord Dunmore, and the people at the bottom, the enslaved population, 40% of the population. And they came together slowly, and it began actually just this week. When he was in the York River, after fleeing Williamsburg, a number of enslaved people showed up. They got on boats, they managed to get out to the Royal Navy ships, and they said, "Give us sanctuary." And some of the captains said no, but at least one said yes, and probably with Dunmore's approval. So suddenly you have enslaved people who are property under Virginia law, who were, escaping and ending up on these British ships. Now, for the Patriots, this was proof of British tyranny. They were stealing the patriots' property without proper due process. So it's hard for us maybe to grasp that, but this really was something that ignited furor among many of the whites in Virginia. So there was one man, Joseph Harris, who was a pilot in Hampton. He escaped to the British, very valuable. He knew how to navigate the creeks and difficult shoal waters of that part of Virginia, and the British were very happy to have him on their side. He was a great strategic asset. The Patriots demanded him back, and in a series of events that I talk about in the book, it turns in this war of words turns into a battle where the British actually go into Hampton and they blast away at the town. The Patriots fire back, the British have to retreat, and it's the beginning of the war in the South. There's no mention of tea. This is all about the human property that the Patriots believed was stolen, and they wanted this person back. So Jefferson said at the end of that battle that Lord Dunmore has commenced hostilities in Virginia. It's raised our country into a perfect frenzy. Be a great title for a book, don't you think? So the Patriots, in the meantime, are pulling together an army in Williamsburg. They begin the march across the James, this long march to get to Norfolk because they don't have boats. They have to go by land. You have to go through the dismal swamp. It takes them weeks and weeks. The Patriots are incredibly disorganized and always fighting with one another. I mean, it's astonishing. The level of incompetence is really very high, and that's in part because they had no experience. Virginia didn't have a standing army. There were very few people who had ever been in the military. Very few people had ever seen a redcoat. So they had to learn all this from scratch. Dunmore, meanwhile, recognizes the threat, and he is secretly beginning to train these dozens and then hundreds of black people who were showing up and saying, here we are. What are you going to do with us? So suddenly Dunmore has this potential army just sitting there, waiting for him to say the word. And he begins, we believe, to give them weapons and to drill them and to kind of secretly train these black soldiers. And he made it official on a date that should be, if not as important as July 4th, it should be known, and it's not. November 15th is when there was a battle at Kemp's Landing. That's often in the history books. That was a skirmish in which a small Patriot force tried to ambush Lord Dunmore, leading a group of redcoats, white loyalists, and armed black men. They were marching through a swamp trying to capture gunpowder and arms that the Patriots had amassed. And in this brief ambush, a black man wounds and captures his owner. And he's the head of the militia. So he brings him to Dunmore, and Dunmore, delighted by this turn of events, really sees it. Hey, these black guys know how to fight. These are tough guys. So he forms, well, first he puts out the Emancipation Proclamation, the first in the British Empire, the first in North America, British North America, that frees any black person, doesn't actually say man, any black person who can fight. They're welcome to come, and you will be freed. You're freed, and then we will give you guns and training. And this immediately happens. He has at least 300 people immediately who sign up and become part of this, what he calls the Ethiopian Regiment, Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. He put his name on it. This is a sign that he respected these people and hoped that they would lead him to victory. Their motto was liberty to slaves. Take that, Patrick Henry. And we know that black recruits arrived not just from Virginia, but from as far away as Massachusetts and New Jersey. They were flocking, of all places, to going south, going to Norfolk to get behind British lines because word of the proclamation spread quickly. Now, the Patriots, remember what I said about this kind of anxiety about a slave insurrection, here it was. This was not the threat of a slave insurrection. This was the largest organized attempt by enslaved people to break free. Not until the Civil War were there anything like the numbers that we see here. I mean, this makes the Nat Turner Rebellion look like a tempest in a teapot. I mean, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds, and maybe, I believe, more than 1,000, if not thousands, who run away from their forced labor camps at great risk. Just simply leaving might get you whipped or imprisoned. So just stepping away is one thing, and then to join the other side, you're risking a lot. So the Patriots, they knew this. Washington, who knew Dunmore, who knew that Dunmore was not a fool, but a very competent military leader who had just fought a war that was very successful, he said if Dunmore is not instantly crushed, he'll become the most formidable enemy America has. And this from the man who was facing the largest British army ever pulled together on the North American continent. So the Continental Congress got in on the act. They were worried as well. So the U.S. Navy was created really at that moment to deal with Dunmore. In the meantime, because the Patriots lacked the guns and the ammunition and the ships that the British had, but they controlled the newspapers. And newspapers were the social media of the 1770s. They were fairly new that you could get a cheap newspaper. This was something that only happened maybe 10, 20, 30 years previously. So suddenly you can get news out there quickly, and it had to be entertaining. It's amazing when you read these newspapers, you could be reading somebody's blog, or Twitter. This campaign to denigrate Dunmore was not done just because they wanted to make the guy who was the enemy look bad. They had to convince the enslaved people of the colonies that they couldn't trust Dunmore. Don't run away. If you do, this guy's going to sell you to the West Indies. Don't trust him. So there was a real reason for the Patriots to have this overt racist propaganda campaign against Dunmore. It had a really important purpose, and that is to try and stymie this growing insurrection. Now, the Patriots also used carrots as well as sticks, and one of the sticks was, oh, and by the way, if you leave your forced labor camp, we will punish your relatives. Yet another reason why you might want to think twice before you cross over to Norfolk. So this all led to the great denouement was a place that many people outside of Virginia never heard of, Great Bridge. Strategic point, you're marching on your way from Williamsburg to Norfolk. You got to cross this southern branch of the Elizabeth River near the Dismal Swamp in order to get to Norfolk. It's the only way. So Dunmore, having recognized this, built this fort down below. I don't want to touch that button. But down below at the bottom right, you'll see it says A. Fort Murray was built, staffed by black soldiers as well as redcoats to prevent the Patriots who were up above from marching across the causeway, crossing the bridge, entering Norfolk. What's known, of course, is the big battle of December 9th, where the British have a big frontal assault, it fails, and the British and Loyalists have to flee to Norfolk. But what's left out of almost all the histories that I encountered was what happened the previous week. In the previous week, for the first time in American history, you have black soldiers with muskets and redcoats who fight American patriots. Almost all white, not all, but mostly white patriots. And these are very bloody clashes, and suddenly the Patriots realize, oh my God, we thought these black people would run away. They can never be soldiers. We never allowed them to have guns. They're not competent. They're not brave. Suddenly, they see that these people are really a threat. And this really frightened many of the Patriots who encountered the ferocity of these now trained soldiers. So, be that as it may, of course, the British lost. They simply didn't have the numbers, and they end up not going back to Norfolk because Norfolk was impossible to defend. You just couldn't defend it. It's too flat, too low. They didn't have enough cannon, so they just said, let's get on the ships in the harbor, because the Royal Navy ships, there were 4 fairly large ships, they could protect anybody who was in the harbor. So suddenly you have maybe 3,000 people, mostly civilians, who have fled from Norfolk and the vicinity on these ships in the winter during some very, very bitter weather. And right next door in Norfolk yourself, you have the Patriots march in with a couple thousand troops. So you can see the problem, right? I mean, this is a standoff for 2 weeks on the last 2 weeks of 1775. Now, just a little segue. So to step back, remember all that talk about the gentry not really liking what was going on in Norfolk because you have these Scottish merchants, their slaves could go to Norfolk and kind of reinvent themselves. This freewheeling port that was outside of the control of the gentry who had a really tight grip on what happened on their plantations. And you have Richard Henry Lee, for example, writing to Jefferson that fall that, Norfolk is just filled with Tories and Negroes. Tories being a shorthand for Scottish merchants. That's really what that term meant at that point in that place. So there were growing public calls throughout the colonies for Norfolk to be destroyed. This was not true of other cities filled with loyalists and black people, for that matter, Philadelphia, Charleston, New York City. But Norfolk was a little different because of its tortured relationship with the gentry. So on October 31st, 1775, Thomas Jefferson cited ancient Carthage, Rome's great rival, that Rome had destroyed in a very brutal fashion back in the 2nd century BC. And he used the term used by a Roman senator at that time, delenda est Carthago. Carthage must be destroyed. He used that term and wrote it in capital letters, very unusual for him in a letter. So he's saying, we should annihilate our own city for reasons that don't seem to have much to do with strategy, military strategy. And in December, the Committee of Safety, which ran Virginia at that point from Williamsburg, they denied that the Patriots intended to burn Norfolk. Everybody in Norfolk, whether they're Patriot or Loyalist, is saying, oh my God, this Patriot army is coming, they're going to destroy us. And they're like, no, that's just silly. You're overreacting. But secretly, they actually did put together plans to destroy the city. Now, the actual destruction, I won't go into a lot of detail, and I'm so delighted that at this exhibit that's out there, because much of what I wrote about comes from those documents and others that they have here at the library, which are a fantastic resource. And I'll go into detail on that later. But what happened was this. The Patriots were there on the shore. They went into the warehouses, and their riflemen were sniping at the fleet. And by January 1st, Dunmore said enough. So that afternoon, he had a barrage coming. He had these Royal Navy ships line up and fire cannon at the city, at the warehouses, as cover so that the men could arrive, Ethiopian regiment members and British Redcoats. They could go on shore, burn the warehouses, clear that area so that the snipers could not use it to harass the fleet. That was the goal. Now, in the end, the fires spread, and 2/3 of the city was destroyed within 3 or 4 days. Dunmore was blamed, and even in Parliament, they believed that he had done it. And this was a huge PR disaster for the British government, one of the biggest that they suffered that year. Washington himself said, the destruction of Norfolk will unite the whole country. If they're burning our cities, what's the point of staying in the British Empire, right? And it was the only city in American history to be reduced to ruin. Not Atlanta, not Columbia, South Carolina, not Chicago, or San Francisco in the earthquake. The only example. Now, the fact is that this wasn't true. We know this because of the documents housed in this building. We know because there was a 1777 committee report that was done when people from Norfolk who had lost everything said, we're destitute, you've got to pay us, you destroyed our city. And they said, well, we'll study the matter. And they did a great job. They put together this really amazing report that goes into great detail about what house was burned when and by whom. It's phenomenal. Spreadsheets and the depositions. They actually deposed lots of eyewitnesses. You had to be a patriot. You couldn't own property because that might influence what you said. And you were interrogated under oath. So these documents, one of which is William Ivy's, is out there, they're heart-rending. Some of the best first-person accounts of the American Revolution that exist. And they've been ignored by historians. They have not even been transcribed. Yeah. So the report was very accurate, but it was hidden. It was classified. It vanished. We don't know really what happened. I was talking with Greg, the archivist here. We don't know what happened, but it didn't resurface for 60 years. By then, of course, everybody, the story of Dunmore being the evil villain is the one that was passed down to me as a child. Now, this matters because in the aftermath of the burning, the Scottish merchants were deported by order of the General Assembly. At the end of the year, the tobacco elite basically wins, right? The Scots are gone. The tobacco gentry are back in charge, but what did they win? Well, not much, because by the time Jefferson is an old man, he realizes that Virginia is a backwater. Virginia is fallen behind everybody else. It has no urban core. It has very little trade. The biggest export, anybody know? Enslaved people being sold down south to the growing cotton plantations. So this was Thomas Jefferson's kind of experiment in creating a republic of farmers. Get rid of the city, and we'll have this republic of good people who are working the earth, and not these urban masses that we can't trust and who are racially mixing. And Jefferson speaks about all this. It's in my book. So really, we see the failure of Jefferson's vision. And what's interesting is that his great rival, the U.S. Supreme Court, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who lived right across the street here, he was actually at Norfolk. He was a young soldier and participated in the destruction of Norfolk. And he writes about it later when he was Chief Justice. He wrote a biography of Washington, and he actually said, its destruction, Norfolk's destruction, was one of those ill-judged measures of which the consequences are felt long after the motives are forgotten. Jefferson, by contrast, never spoke publicly about the destruction of Norfolk or its impact on this state. And that's an image, by the way, of Norfolk 20 years later, done by Benjamin Latrobe, who also did work famous as an architect of the Capitol. So that's what the city looked like even 20 years later. Now, just very briefly, in a lot of histories, okay, Norfolk is burned, Dunmore hangs about, and then he's finally kicked out of Virginia. Well, that's not what happened. He actually remained a potent threat, he and the Ethiopian regiment, well into August of 1776. I mentioned 3,000 people, maybe 100 vessels in the harbor. The Patriots could do nothing. They sent General Charles Lee down, the second in command, to try and get rid of Dunmore. Charles Lee couldn't do anything. The U.S. Navy fleet aborted its mission. It decided we're not going to mess with those. We don't have the firepower to deal with this threat. And Dunmore he created a land base across from Norfolk at what's now Hospital Point, the Naval Hospital, and it was impregnable. And it was fortified. They had ovens, they had barracks, they were drilling the Ethiopian regiment soldiers. They had a cemetery because people were dying of various diseases, crammed together like that. Viruses were spreading. But this was a real threat to the Patriot movement long after Norfolk was a smoking ruin. And what really did things in was, well, there's a virus and a vote. Like that alliteration. So there was a smallpox outbreak that happened really not until April or May of 1776, and it began to decimate the fleet. So Dunmore had to move the fleet up to Gwynn's Island, halfway up the Chesapeake Bay, find an isolated place, inoculate the Ethiopian soldiers. When you do that, you're out of commission for a couple of weeks, kind of like the COVID vaccine, for a couple of days. You don't want to do anything. So it was a treacherous time. So they leave Norfolk, they go to this more rural area. Meanwhile, there's a unanimous vote in Williamsburg for independence. Now remember, Dunmore is like 35 miles away. I mean, there's a threat on their doorstep, and they decide, look, there's no arguing, there's no negotiating. We have to seek independence. And when the largest, most important, most populous colony unanimously voted for independence. It broke the deadlock in Philadelphia. Delaware, South Carolina, New York. New York didn't even adopt the Declaration at first. All of these states, Pennsylvania, they were on the fence. They really weren't keen on independence. But what happened in Williamsburg that day broke that deadlock. And so July 4th, of course, we have the Declaration. If you read it closely, it's all complaining about all the things that Dunmore is accused of doing, burning cities, slave insurrections, it's all there. July 9th, 5 days later, the Patriots attack Dunmore. Finally, they get their act together. They fire cannon. Dunmore has to disperse, has to leave the island. They sail around the Chesapeake, and finally in August, they move up to New York, where they all participate in the battle to take New York away from George Washington. All right, so ripple effects. This is important because this is such a great story to me, but what's even more important are the impact that it had, not just on this side of the ocean, but in Britain. So first of all, I mentioned the Ethiopian troops. They went to New York. They actually become part of the British Army. Washington, because of the Ethiopian regiment, is forced to accept black people into the Continental Army. He didn't want it. He refused. He was not even going to let those who were in the Army re-enlist. Days after getting news of the Emancipation Proclamation, he changed his mind. And the result was the most integrated American military force until the Korean War. So you had maybe 20,000 black Americans fighting for the British, 3 times the number of patriots. Now we know why. The patriots were not offering emancipation, the British were. And in the end, tragically, some 10,000 black Americans had to leave this country to avoid being re-enslaved. And that included Virginians like Governor Benjamin Harrison, who sent slave patrols into New York when it was still occupied by the British, before the British left, to try and seize his slaves. He wrote to Washington saying, I need these guys back, I mean, life's hard without them. Washington himself sent slave catchers into New York. Jefferson they all were involved in trying to get their slaves back. People who had been freed by the British, and in many cases had been free for 7 or 8 years, suddenly were facing the prospect of being hauled back into literal chains. So the abolition movement also gained steam as a result of people seeing black people with guns. In Britain, the fact that these people were loyal and had fought for the British Empire had an impact. And then finally, you can't have Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation without Dunmore. He's the one that started this ball rolling. He didn't intend for it to go where it went, but by starting that ball rolling, he created a legal precedent that Lincoln drew on in order to make this proclamation have a legal framework. So, we're at the 250th anniversary, and when I was 10, it was perfectly fine to have a story of good guys versus bad guys. But at age 250, I think we can take a more subtle approach to what the revolution was about. First of all, let's look beyond New England. New England, we know that story, it's an important story, but it's only half the story. What happened in the South is really critical to understand why we have a nation in the first place. Then, as Sarah mentioned, that really we can find the seeds of what's in the headlines today: race, gun control, immigration. These were issues that really started to gestate in Virginia in the 1775 and 1776 era. And finally, I think it's time to acknowledge that the black Americans who fought for the British were freedom seekers. They wanted liberty too. And so I think now we really need to celebrate not the color of someone's coat or their ethnicity, but the fact that they were fighting for the kind of belief, they were fighting for liberty. They were fighting for exactly what this nation wants to be, a place where people get to live their lives in freedom. So that said, I think we have a great opportunity to rethink the revolution and to really try and find a way to see it as a richer, more interesting story than that of the villain versus the hero. So thank you. And happy to take questions. And there are mics here, which the staff can bring to you. So just raise your hand and they'll bring you your mic. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So in your research about Lord Dunmore and what he's done, have you encountered any first-hand or second-hand accounts of the slaves, like about him from the slaves who, of the members of the Ethiopian regiment who fled to Canada?
So the question is about the Ethiopian regiment members who went to Canada. There are unfortunately very, very few first-person accounts from any of these hundreds or thousands of people. But we do have a few from those who went to Canada. First of all, we have the Book of Negroes, which was the book that the British put together which lists the names and ages and what people looked like and who their previous owners were. It's an incredible resource, 3,000 people, so we have that data. There are a few. Boston King, for example, he was an enslaved person from South Carolina who wrote much later about his experience in the war. But again, it's not, we just don't have the documents, and I'm hoping that things will show up. But most of these people were not literate, and when they were, often it was years later that they would write something, and then of course it often was ignored and was not archived. So we really labor under the lack of data. But stay tuned, because I have an article coming out in a magazine at the end of this month, at the end of this year, which goes into some detail about the Black Loyalists. It's a fantastic story. These Black Americans, the first Black diaspora, who went to Australia, they went to England, and they founded the first colony of free people. People had been enslaved or emancipated in Africa, Sierra Leone. And Harry Washington was one of them, a guy who was born in Africa, was taken across the Middle Passage to Virginia. Washington buys him. When Washington goes to war, he leaves, joins Dunmore, ends up in New York, fighting for the British, goes down to Charleston where he fights for the British, ends up in Canada at the end of the war. Canada is not such a great place for him. He ends up going back to Africa and becoming a farmer. And then, because he decides that Sierra Leone is run by British administrators who are not much better than his white owners, decides to foment a rebellion. But this one fails, and he's exiled, and that's the last we hear of him. But what an extraordinary life. Yes, ma'am.
Shelburne, Nova Scotia has a wonderful museum documenting all the blacks who went up there to escape slavery down here. And they probably have the best collection anywhere of individual testimonies.
Yes, absolutely. So the Black Loyalist Center, it's in Birchtown, just outside of Shelburne. Birchtown named after Birch, the general who signed their emancipation certificates. So I went there to visit, and I introduced myself to the director, and she said, well, where are you from? And I said, well, I'm from Norfolk. She said, I'm 8th generation Norfolk. And she was black, and she said it with this maritime Canadian accent. It was like, wow. So they actually maintain that connection. They remember their connection to this part of the world where we've generally forgotten it. So we're actually going to have a symposium in Norfolk in November where we're going to have some of them come down to talk about their relationship to Tidewater in particular.
These are two kind of related questions. One, did Dunmore write anything after the war that can give us a sense of his evaluation afterwards? And secondly, do we have any sense, either from his writing or from others' writings, about whether he saw any ideology or Enlightenment philosophy in all of his decisions, or whether it was just a matter of military strategy and how to keep the patriots from gaining an advantage?
Right. Well, it's a great question. Well, Dunmore was in Edinburgh, and during the Scottish Enlightenment, when slavery was being discussed, the morality of slavery. We don't know, but he was certainly in discussions. And we know that at the end of the war, actually the war was still going on in 1781, and he thought that Cornwallis was going to win, so he came back from Britain, and was in Charleston actually when he learned that the Cornwallis had failed and that the war basically was over. Dunmore was so focused on using the black population to ensure the British Empire didn't collapse that he proposed 10,000 enslaved people be freed and that they be paid and that they be allowed to be officers, and they would march to Virginia from South Carolina, and they would put an end to this silly rebellion. He talked to the king, he talked to General Clinton. Dunmore throughout the war was constantly arguing that the best strategy we can have is to free these enslaved people. And it clearly wasn't just about him getting what he wanted. The fact that he put his name on this regiment, the fact that he wanted them to be paid, become officers, I mean, these were unusual tactics for any British leader at the time. Cornwallis didn't want to have any black person in his army. He had them do menial tasks, wouldn't give them arms, refused to give them any kind of responsibility, and may have contributed to his defeat. So I think Dunmore was practical and pragmatic. I think if I could talk about his psychology for a moment, here's a guy who watched Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745 land in Scotland with 6 or 7 guys. And he was going to conquer the British Empire. And he almost did. So Dunmore was there when Bonnie Prince Charlie marched through the Highlands and into England and managed to bring together this kind of coalition of different people and hold it together and almost capture London. So I think that Dunmore was a Highlander and understood prejudice. The English treated the Scots very badly at that time. They were seen as barbarians, drunk barbarians. And so I think Dunmore viewed the black people he encountered, particularly after he's in battle with them, in a different way. That's my supposition. But we know at the end of his life, there's a great quote from Jeremy Bentham, famous English philosopher and scientist, who said, "Oh yes, Lord Dunmore, I did scientific experiments with him, and he shocked me exceedingly by saying that Jesus may not have been the only one who gave a revelation to us, but Muhammad and others of the Hindu faith may have done so too." And this shocked Jeremy Bentham, who was a famous atheist. So I think that Dunmore had these liberal tendencies that certainly must be related to the way he could have dealt with enslaved people, even though he was a slave owner for many years of his life. He was able to see them in a way that his, I think, contemporaries could not. Yes, sir.
What impact did this experience have on the debate, perhaps most closely associated with Wilberforce, on the abolition of the British slave trade not too long after the American Revolution?
Yes. It's a great question. I think there's no direct line, but I think what we can say is that the American patriots really believed that King George III, as soon as he heard about this proclamation from Dunmore, was going to publicly refute it. But the king did not. The king didn't say anything. I think the feeling in London was, well, let's just see what happens here, right? The slave owners from the West Indies, they were terrified. They didn't like this, but the British military was like, no, I think this could work. Let's see what we can do. So General Clinton then follows in the footsteps of Dunmore, and others do as well. So the British government basically, based on Dunmore's kind of on-the-fly decision, because Dunmore couldn't communicate with London at that point. He did this on his own, without orders from London. But once it was de facto policy, and then other British leaders followed that policy, it had a huge impact on the growth of the abolitionist movement down the line, because people like Wilberforce, who then came to the fore later, could point to it and say, well, see, here's some British military leaders. These aren't religious zealots, right? These are practical people. They did it. Clearly, these are people, worthy of freedom. So it did have a tremendous impact, I think, on the psychology of British leaders, if not the British people. Yes.
Thank you so much for a riveting talk and this call for an expansionist review. I'm really curious about this, the inside job in Norfolk, and the 60-year cover-up, and then statements or like the lack thereof by these absolutely famous and celebrated founding fathers, if you will. Was there any sort of, and we're probably well past statute of limitations, but was there any kind of legal, I don't know, a fallout or response or legislation or debate about this poor choice or lack of strategy, or how do we prevent ourselves from making these kinds of decisions in the future, after the fact or at any point during that interim?
The only person I found other than John Marshall, who's writing, many decades later, and he's writing kind of, I think, with an eye toward Jefferson, his rival, was Adam Stevens, who was a military officer who says, it was ridiculous that we destroyed Norfolk. We feel the destruction of it every day. It's been a terrible thing. And Stevens was ignored. Other than him, I found no evidence that there was any kind of attempt to come to terms with what had happened, in part because it was a propaganda campaign that was vitally necessary for the Patriots at the time. And then after the fact, nobody wanted to admit that the Patriots had committed what must be considered the largest war crime during the American Revolution, and that they covered it up. And that it wasn't just a bunch of drunk soldiers who went on a spree, which is what I was told as a child. Well, Dunmore burned it, but these soldiers, they were drunk and they weren't professional. And no, this came from the top. This came from Thomas Jefferson and Edmund Pendleton, who was actually in charge of Virginia at that point. And it was a concerted effort to wipe out what was seen as a pox in Virginia. That is, this city, which was, as Jefferson later describes, he describes cities as terrible places. And so it's almost like he saw in colonial Norfolk this kind of disease that would spread unless it was stamped out. And I don't think the other founders saw it quite the same way. Jefferson was kind of peculiar in his intellectual ideas, unique too, but I think that they all recognized that Norfolk was a threat because of the enslaved people who were going there and were becoming emancipated, Scottish traders who were proto-capitalists, who were out to do something different than what the tobacco gentry were doing. So there were a lot of practical reasons for them to feel that this was an opportunity. And afterwards, nobody wanted to, 60 years when that report. Now, I don't know, and this is something that I'm hoping Greg can help me discover, is like, well, what happened to that report? Is there anything about why it was covered up? But from what I can see, it simply went against the Patriot story. And by the time it came out, the story was already solidified, and nobody wanted to look at it. And I think we need to look at it because I know that my own hometown destroyed itself again during redevelopment in the 1950s and 60s. We were talking about that earlier. So I think the city went through this trauma that it still hasn't come out of. There are repercussions to committing crimes like that and then not trying to account for them, at least be honest about them. That's the best answer I think I can give.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, Dunmore, of course, lived for quite a while after the war. And what is the relationship between his life and slavery in those remaining years? I know I think eventually he becomes governor of Bermuda, if I remember.
The Bahamas.
Bahamas. And I have the impression that he's involved in some conspiracies in the southeastern United States that have anti-slavery dynamics. Right. I don't know that he owned slaves himself again.
Yes, so Dunmore needed a job once he was done with Virginia. So he got the job of the Bahamas, running the Bahamas. And it's very interesting because two things happen. One, he goes to the Bahamas, he buys slaves, and he buys plantations. And enslaved people come to him and they say, we were wrongly enslaved. We were freed in America, and these white loyalists brought us here, and so we should be free. And he set up a commission to adjudicate this. And it infuriated the white planters that he would do this. And actually there was a group of enslaved people who built a kind of small town behind the governor's mansion where they could kind of be safe. And Dunmore told the whites, you better leave those people alone. So he offered them this refuge, and yet at the same time, he's exploiting them. Very complicated, interesting person, right? So in the Bahamas, he actually had to leave, not because of that, but because his daughter made the rather poor choice of marrying a son of King George III without getting permission, and in Rome. So Dunmore was recalled, and he went in to see the king, and you gotta love Dunmore for this. He went in to see the king, and the king said, like, oh, those bastard children, because they had children. And Dunmore said, you mean like your children, sire? And I think his son, Dunmore's son, reported that the king turned red as a poppycock and left through a door. And that was the end of Dunmore's career. So he was basically exiled, socially exiled. He and his wife had to go to a small town on the coast of England, and they lived out the rest of their lives with very little money. They were quite poor for that class. And that was the end of Dunmore. So he had this kind of tragic end when his entire family, again, after coming out of this great shame of rebelling against the king, and then in the end they fall back into this being socially radioactive. So I want to thank you all very much.